Alright, now let's check if the query has run successfully. So we're going to use exactly the same code we used earlier in the sign up code. Okay, so let's just copy and paste the code from there. Okay, we're going to keep the same error message. Okay, so if the query is not successful, we're going to echo this message and exit the code. Now, if the query has been successful, we're going to send an email. Okay, the email is going to contain a link with the user ID and activation code. So again, we can copy the same code from the sign up file. All right, and then adjust the code slightly. So let's copy all this. Okay, and paste it in there. Okay, so the first step is to send an email, okay, with a link. So the link is going to go to the resetspassword.php file, all right, instead of the activate file. And we need to place the user ID and the activation code in the link. Okay, so instead of email and key, we're going to have user ID and key. Okay, so the user ID is going to be like this. Okay, equal sign, and we're going to use our user ID variable like that, and then the key, and for the key we're going to use our key variable. Now to send the email, we're going to use the mail function as we did before, and we're going to need the email address of our user. Okay, so we're going to use the email variable for that, and that's going to be the first parameter of our PHP mail function. The subject of the email is going to be reset your password. Okay, and then we're going to have the message or the body of the email, and we're going to keep the other parameters as they are. Okay, now if the email has been sent successfully, we're just going to send or echo a success message, and in this message we're going to write something like an email has been sent to the email address provided. Okay, and please click on the link to reset your password. And a quick change to the body of the email, we will need to say something like, please click on this link to reset your password. Okay, instead of activating an account. All right, so now let's save our code and just copy these comments in the right place. Okay, right there. That's better. All right, now let's test our code. So we're going to refresh the page and then click on the login link and then forgoes password. So let's give our email address and click on the submit button. Okay, so we've got a success message. So let's check our inbox. All right, so we've got an email and we can see the link in the email. So this is going to take our user to the resetspassword.php file. Okay, so now we're going to need to write some code inside that file. Okay, so this file is going to receive a couple of parameters, the user ID and the key. These parameters are going to be taken from the link, okay, which we sent by email. Now we're going to be doing some styling later on using Bootstrap. So to save time, we can just copy the file structure from our activate file, okay, and then adjust it as we like. So let's paste it right there. Okay. So let's take out these comments and change the title of our page to password resets. That's better. Okay. Let's also change this heading to reset password. Okay. Alright, now right after the heading, we're going to perform a few checks. And if everything is fine, we're going to show our user a form so that they can reset their password. Otherwise, we're going to show them an error message. So first of all, if we look at the steps we're going to need to follow, we're going to need to check if the user ID and the activation key are missing. Okay, so if that's the case, we're going to print an error message. Okay, so let's start with this step first. Okay. So if the user ID or activation key is missing, so the code is going to be very similar to what we did in the activate code. So instead of email, we're going to have the user ID. Okay. And we have the key as well. And these are the same parameters that you will find in the link that we sent by email. Okay. So the key and the user ID. All right. Now, if any of these is missing, we're going to show an error message. So let's say, please click on the link you received by email instead of activation link. Okay, that was supposed to be activation link anyway. So that's going to be the link you received by email. Let's save this and let's just go back to the activate code and change that to activation link. Okay. Now, if none of our parameters is missing, we're going to store them in a couple of variables, okay? And then we're going to define another variable, okay, for time, and then we're going to prepare the variables for the query, okay? So let's go ahead and do this. So we're going to keep the same comments as in the previous code, okay? So we're going to store these in two variables. So instead of email, we're going to have the user ID, okay? And we're going to have the key, okay? And then we're going to have a third variable for time, okay? So we're going to define a variable time where we're going to store not the current time, okay, but the time 24 hours ago, okay? And the reason why is because we want to compare the time we find in the database to the time corresponding to 24 hours ago to see if the key is still valid or not, okay? Because if you remember, the key is only valid for 24 hours. All right, so now we're going to prepare the variables for the query. So the user ID is a variable that we received through that link, okay? So you're going to need to clean it to avoid any SQL injection, okay? And the same thing applies for the key. All right. Now the next step is to run a query, okay, which will check if the combination of the user ID and the key, which we received through the link, that combination, we need to make sure that it exists in our database, okay? And also, you're going to need to make sure that the key is still valid, which means that it's less than 24 hours old, okay? So let's go ahead and do this. So the query is going to be as following. So we're going to select the user ID, okay, from our table forgot password. Okay, and the condition is going to be the key needs to be matching the key we have in the link. Okay, and the user ID needs to match the one we have in the link. Okay, so where key equals our key variable, okay, and the user ID equals our user ID variable. Okay, and the third condition is that the key is still valid. So we need the time, okay, of the key to be greater than our time variable, which is the time 24 hours ago. Okay, so an easy way to look at this, the key is going to be expired if it's too old, okay, and it's going to be too old if the time of the key, okay, is too small. So the greater the time is, the more recent our key is. Okay, all right, so that's our query. Now we're going to run the query using the MySQL query function as we did before. Okay, and then the next step is to check if the query is successful. Okay, so if the query is not successful, we're going to show an error message. So the way we're going to do this is different from the following code, okay, which applies for an insert query. Okay, so we're going to do something very similar to what we did before with a select query, okay, like this one. And then we're going to move to the next step, which is checking if the combination does not exist. So if the combination does not exist, we're going to show an error message. Okay, so now the query has run successfully. Okay, and we're now checking if the combination does not exist. So if that's the case, we're going to show an error message. So the combination will exist if the number of rows inside our results objects is equal to 1, okay? And that's very similar to what we did before with the select queries. So let's check one of those files. Okay, so this is a good example. So we're going to define a variable count where we count the number of rows in the results, and then we're going to check if the count is different than 1. Okay. So if the count is different than 1, then we're going to show an error message saying something like wrong parameters. Okay, or please try again. Okay. Now, if the count is equal to 1, then we're going to skip this bit of our code, and we're going to move to the next step, which is to print the actual form for our user, okay, to reset their password. So that's going to be the next step. Okay, that's a comment. All right. So our form is going to have a couple of hidden fields, and I'm going to explain this in a bit. Okay, so we're going to echo our form. All right, like this. Okay. So we're going to use the form tag.